We want to address a few questions today about the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, and we're looking for a guideline as to A, who's included in the obligation of Talmud Torah, B, what is the scope of that obligation, and number three, does every single Jew have to become a Talmud Chacham? Is that something that's incorporated into the Rambam and the mitzvah of Talmud Torah? Now, if we're asking the question, who's obligated in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah, we might want to divide it up into two categories. There are people who, thank God, they're financially secure, they are healthy and capable of dedicating themselves to the study of Torah. And those individuals for sure are obligated in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. But what do we do with the following categories? Let's say a person is very poor and he's got to dedicate himself to eke out a living so that his time is really preoccupied. He doesn't own his own time. Or we might talk about the opposite extreme, somebody who's very, very wealthy, but he's got, cities that he owns, he's got properties, he's got to build up a business and dedicate himself to that. We could talk about someone who's not healthy. Rahman al-Islam, he's very difficult for him to concentrate on Talmud Torah when he's in pain. We could even talk about someone who's on his deathbed, on the very last day of his life. And in all these cases, the Rambam addresses the issue head on without any, he's not holding back, no compunctions as to whether or not in all these categories there's a chiyuv of Talmud Torah. So we want to really look carefully at Perek Aleph Halacha Tes, and I think Halacha Tes is like a continuation of Halacha Ches, so it's almost like an indivisible group, Ches and Tes. And we'll start with the first 6 words of the Rambam. Kol ish mi Yisrael chayav b'Talmud Torah. And this is a very bold statement because the implications are far-reaching. Kol ish mi Yisrael, there's no one left out. No one is excluded or exempt from the chiyuv of Talmud Torah, which would mean that every single last Jew would have to know the laws of Talmud Torah and study the mitzvah and the obligation to study Torah because it's all relevant. There's no one excluded. Kol ish mi Yisrael. Now, I was wondering if the Rambam went out of his way to add the word kol ish mi Yisrael to include even a rasha. He's an evildoer. And the Rambam wants to tell you, okay, you're guilty of sin, but it doesn't mean, therefore, that you're exempt from the chiyuv of Talmud Torah. I mean, if you don't study Torah, that's going to add another sin, to your pekala. Like, for example, the famous story of the Vilna Gaon, that he had this dialogue with an apikoros who never denied the existence of God. So the Gaon offered him something to drink in the course of this deliberation. And the man picked up his cup and he was about to start drinking. And the Gaon said, wait a minute, you have to make a bracha. So the man said, I don't believe in God. So the Gaon says, that's not going to pater you up from punishment for not making a bracha. You got to make a bracha. So Kol Ish Yisrael, you might fit into a category of a Russia, but you're still obligated. That doesn't pater. You don't think you're a big shot, and because you're a Russia, you're exempt from Talmud Torah. But there's no doubt that the words Talmud Torah are very heavy words, and of course, this section of the Rambam of Sefer Mat is called Hilchos Talmud Torah. And we study these halachas and we realize, well, Talmud Torah is a very extensive and heavy duty mitzvah that requires a great deal, of work and energy. This is not, an easy mitzvah that requires a couple of minutes here and there. So when we say Kol Ish Mi Yisrael Chayav B'Talmud Torah, you know, that has tremendous ramifications. No doubt that the Rambam, when he writes Kol Ish Yisrael Chayav B'Talmud Torah, is coming to include the following categories in the continuation that he spells out here: Bein Ani, Bein Oshir. So the Ani is claiming, well, I'm preoccupied with eking out a living. You can't expect me to study Torah, and the Ashir is preoccupied with keeping on top of his business and his workers and so forth and so on. I mentioned, Chulin Daf Kufhei, Kuvav. I mean, where the Gemara goes through details about how you have to be on top of all your workers. You can't just let them go on their own. So comes along the Ani and he claims, I can't do it. Comes along the Usher, he says, I don't have time to do it. And the Rambam says, no. He's Chayav, B'Talmud Torah, Bein Ani, Bein Ashir. Now, it's very interesting because in the sequence of the Rambam's formulation of these categories, it seems to me, I'll try to prove this, that he goes min hakal el hachamor, meaning he's going up a step ladder, going from the easier ones to the harder ones, which means that being an Ashir is even more difficult than learning Torah as an Ani. An Ani is he's got his responsibility, but the Ashir, it's even more difficult for him to study Torah, which is sort of counterintuitive. But now the Rambam goes on to include a category that's even more difficult, more of a challenge, and that is Shalom Begufo or Bal Yisurim. That the health status of the person, whether he has a clean bill of health or Chas v'Shalom, he's a Bal Yisurim and he's suffering so much, even he's included in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. I mean, that already takes it a whole new level, higher than, the financial consideration. Then the Rambam wants to talk about age. And he says, Bein Bachur, Bein Shayus Zokein, Gadol. So we're talking not only about an older person, but a very old person. Shetoshash Kocho. He certainly doesn't have the energies of a young person. And that's even more difficult sometimes than a Bal Yisurim because, he's trying to keep afloat. It's at the end of his life and his energies are limited. Now, I call this the Resha. And I believe that this halacha ches should be divided into two sections. Because now he speaks about afilu. And it seems to me the afilu could have come earlier. He could have said, Oni, afilu oshir, afilu bal yisurim, afilu zaken gadol shetoshash kocho. He never mentions the word oshir, afilu, until he gets to the last two categories. And that's afilu haya oni amisparnes min hatzdaka umechazer al apsoch afilu bal ishu bonim chayev likvol ozman litalmud. So my first question is, does the word afilu indicate that stop? Now I want to introduce two categories that come under a whole different chalos, if you will, a whole different halachic consideration. Question number two is, he already mentioned the ani in the Reisha. Is he just expanding the ani to include a very, very poor person? He's so destitute that he needs to support himself and survive through charity. That's a little bit odd, because why would I think otherwise? Once he already has an ani, we have a principle that stimas lashon Rambam, meaning the Rambam includes under ani any ani, but now he has to spell it out. Then he has afilu ishu banu. This I find very fascinating. I mean, we Baruch Hashem, we get married, we have children. And why would the Rambam like leave that at the end, as if to say that's the pinnacle, like that's the most difficult, challenging case? But the real question that I want to ask you is in the next part of the Rambam, where he says, Chayev likvol ozman l'talmud Torah bayom u'balayla. Literally translated, he has to designate some time in the day, the 12 hours of daylight, and sometime in the 12 hours of night in a perfect day. But the Rambam doesn't say that he is studying Torah by day or night, but rather he's being kovei zman. Is there some sort of new category here that the Rambam has not formulated until now in the first 8 halachas, and that is likvo zman, kvi zman. Like, for example, the Mishnah says that there are 3 questions I'm going to ask you, Leosid Lava. One is Hakavata itim la Torah. So the word kvius of Zman seems to be a very important phrase, not to be identified with Talmud Torah in general, which would mean that the Rambam seems to be included, presenting a whole new category within the matrix of Talmud Torah. And I strengthen that understanding of the Rambam because he says Shenemar. And we'll see the Shenemar in a second, but why does the Rambam feel compelled to add the Shenemar? He's already established 2 psukim from which we derive the chiyuv of Talmud Torah. He's got the chiyuv of Limanit Mosam Mispnechem. He's got Vishinantam Livanecha. And now all of a sudden, Shenemar, and he quotes a pasuk in Yoshua, Sefer Yoshua, V'yigisa bo yom v'layla. So that Shenemar V'yigisa bo yom v'layla, in my mind, is proof positive. It's a clincher that the Rambam is introducing a whole new chiyuv here. Now, if the Rambam is introducing a whole new category, a whole new branch of Talmud Torah, which he derives from V'yigisa bo, then I go back to my original question: is there a reisha and a seifa in this Rambam? Meaning that we put a great emphasis on the word afilu, as if the Rambam after the afilu is introducing a whole new category that has 2 subcategories. It's oni mechazal apsochim and bal yishu banu. Because if we assume that the afilu is a divider between the reisha of the Rambam and the seifa of the Rambam, then when the Rambam at the end says chayev likvol lo zman l'talmud Torah, is he going back to the reisha, or it's only an addition? It's only an add-on to the seifa, meaning from afilu and on we have a chiyuv likvol lo zman, etc. Shenemar v'yigisa bo. But as far as category number 1, up to the word afilu, which means ani, ashir, and shalom begufo bal yisurim, and even zaken gadol, as far as all those ani v'ashir, etc., that then the chiyuv is Talmud Torah, meaning whatever we learned here in the Hilchos Talmud Torah, that's incumbent upon all those categories of ani, ashir, bal yisurim, zaken gadol. They all have a full-fledged, absolute, all-encompassing chiyuv of Talmud Torah, and that's why the Rambam opens up by saying Kol ish Yisrael chayav b'Talmud Torah. When the Rambam at the end of this halacha says, no, forget about Talmud Torah. I'm going to derive from a pasuk v'gisavo a new chiyuv, a breakthrough chiyuv with its own definition, and that is likvol ozman bayom ubalayla. That applies only to the second category, post v'afilu. If you're following the way I'm trying to read this Rambam and structure it. So if that be the case, if you're following my logic here, what comes before the afilu and what comes after the afilu? Why does the Rambam designate two different mitzvos within the greater constellation of Talmud Torah? One is literally chayav b'Talmud Torah. The other is chayav l'kvolo itim, or shall we say zman l'Talmud Torah bayom u'balayla. What are these two different categories? What came before the afilu, and it's included in the general all-inclusive mitzvah of Talmud Torah? What comes after the afilu? What new categories and breakthrough does Ram have with the Ani HaMachazal Psochim or the Bal Ishu Banim, that, if you pardon the term, it downgrades the chiyuv of Talmud Torah to a chiyuv of likva lo zman min hayom min halayla. So let's ask the following question in order to answer this last very important question. What's the havamina here? Meaning, why would I have argued without the Rambam that an ani, an ashir, a bal yisurim, or a zaken gadol she toshash kocho would be exempt from Talmud Torah? And the Rambam comes lafuki komashmalan that these categories are chayav in Talmud Torah. And I believe the answer to that question lies back in halacha hey. So if you take a rewind to halacha hey, the Rambam speaks about getting married and the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And the Rambam says that he should postpone getting married. Why? She'im nasa isha tchila, if he'll get married first, ein daito pnuya lilmod. So we want to underline those two words, daito pnuya. And what the Rambam seems to indicate is that you need a clear mind in order to study Torah. Again, if you're just reading words, and sometimes I hate to admit it, but Daf Yomi is kind of like that, then you don't have to have Daito Pnuya. But if you're really studying Torah, seriously, which I hope we're doing now, then you need a Daito Pnuya. In modern Hebrew, we would call it Daito Tzlula. Tzlula means clear. He's got a clear mind. So the Ram has four individuals that l'chora in the Havamina did not have a clear mind. And they would not be able to fulfill, or for that matter, be obligated to the mitzvah Talmud Torah, which requires a clear mind. Because in all those four categories, or subcategories, if you want to call it that, very hard to concentrate. This is what I call da'aga. I don't have to tell you what that word means. I just recently saw a cute line in one of these blurbs. They said, I knew that worrying would really be helpful because it always works out well. Meaning as if to say, because he worries, that's why it worked out well. But we worry. And if we're poor, Nebuch, we worry. Where's our next loaf of bread going to come from? If we're rich, we're worried about the success, the ongoing success of our geschäft. If we are Bal Yisurim, we're too preoccupied with our suffering to possibly achieve a clear mind in order to study Torah. And certainly a Zaken Gadol Shetashash Kocho, he's very weak. He can hardly think about moving his legs. Now you're going to tell him, well, think about Havayas Dabaya V'Rava. That's already. So we understand the Hamamin of the Rambam, and the reason why the Rambam needs a Chidush and a Kamashmal, and based on the requirement in Torah of Daito Pnuya, because we would think that these individuals do not have Daito Pnuya, and therefore they're not obligated, they're exempt from Talmud Torah. Kamashmal, the Rambam wants to say no. Kol ish misol chayav Talmud Torah, even if he's a bal daiga, he's worried about his business, he's worried about his, future parnasa, he's worried about his suffering situation, his illness, and so forth and so on. Ram says no, he's obligated in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah. And we're going to have to see where the Rambam derived this conclusion from, because I think we've made a good, solid case for the Havamina that there's no Daito Pnuyos. So how does Rambam know that that's not so? And a person has to be misgaber, he has to overcome his daiga, put it on the side, concentrate on Abai V'Rava, or Rabbi Yochanan Reish Lakish, or Rabbi Meir and Rabbi Yehuda, and be able to focus on his Talmud Torah and achieve. How does Rambam know that? Maybe Enochinami, all these categories of Bali Daiga should be exempt from Talmud Torah. And amongst the sources for this Rambam is a Gemara in Masechta Yoma, which the Kesef Mishnah quotes not here but elsewhere. And the Gemara in Yoma talks about someone who comes up to the pearly gates, Liacham Evi Yasrim, and they ask him, how come you didn't study Torah? So he comes up with the following answer. He says, I was very poor. So they point to Hillel, who was poor, pardon the expression, as a church mouse. He didn't have enough money to get through the day, and yet he studied Torah. And the very little kopika that he got on a daily basis for his work as a chotev eitzim, he would cut down trees. He would split it in half. Half he would give to support his family, and half he would pay for the entrance into the yeshiva, into the Beis Medrash. So you're not poorer than Hillel, and yet I can point to Hillel and see that he's capable of learning Torah despite the Daigas Parnasa. And then the Gemara goes on to quote, I believe it's Rabbi Lazar Charsum, that his father left him 60 cities on the coastline, and yet he would put a knapsack on his back and go from city to city to learn Torah. You heard about this chacham here and that chacham there. Are you richer than he was? And yet he was studying Torah. Now, I'm bothered by this because if that's the source of the Rambam, as the Kesef Mishnah seems to indicate, how could you bring proof and establish halacha l'doros for every last Jew called Ish v'Ish Yisrael Chayev based on these gedolim, these great, gedolei tzadikim, gedolei chachamim? You could tell me all these stories. You could read biographies about the gedolim, and they say about Reb Chaim that he was actually married to the Nitziv's granddaughter. He once at like 3 a.m, the Nitziv approached him and said, "I want to hear your answer to the following question." Reb Chaim said, "I didn't say Birchas Torah yet." So the Nitziv spoke. It's already 3 a.m, and you didn't say Birchas Torah. Yeah. So we read about these biographies of the greats. And okay, it's nice to be inspired by them, but what they did lifnim mishus hadin because of their piety and chasidus, that doesn't determine halacha l'doros. So that's a question that has to be addressed. Where does the Ram have a proof that Ani and Ashir and so forth and so on are chayiv in Talmud Torah, and they can't claim, we didn't have a possibility of studying Torah b'das pnuyim. Now we get to the afilu. I think the afilu is addressing a whole new category. We're not talking about daito pnuya. We've already established that an ani has to get to the level of daito pnuya. That's within his obligation. But here we get to a different issue, and that's what I call zman. You cannot obligate a person in the mitzvah of Talmud Torah if he has no time to study Torah. So imagine you've got this ani who's mechazer al psachim, and he's putting out his hand, he's panhandling, he's trying to eke out enough of those, here in Israel we call them shkolim, in order to get through the day. And now you're going to tell me, stop everything and study Torah. He doesn't have the time for Talmud Torah. This is a whole different issue. The Rambam's afilu has nothing to do with being preoccupied with daiga, but rather being preoccupied with your time to keep yourself afloat. And you're so preoccupied with your time, you have no free time to study Torah. Take, for example, about Ishu Banim. So again, I have a few young children. My wife is taking care of the baby, and I have to take care of the other children. Who else is going to do it? My time is not my own. I don't have any free time. I can't just drop my children and run and say, okay, no problem. I'm going to study Torah, find me in the Beis Medrash, and, 12 midnight, get me home from the Beis Medrash. No. I don't have the time. I'm preoccupied with watching my children, with raising my children. And here I believe, and again, I might get my head chopped off for this. I don't know. I don't know if this is emes lamito. We'll ask the Rambam when we see him. But I think what the Rambam is saying in the afilu is that even someone who's not chayav in Talmud Torah, he cannot be chayav in Talmud Torah. Why? Because he doesn't have freedom of time. So again, as far as like the Gaver is concerned, he's chayav in Talmud Torah. But if his mind is preoccupied and he doesn't have time, then befall, in actuality, he's exempt from Talmud Torah. And the Rambam doesn't deny that. What the Rambam says is that although he doesn't have time for Talmud Torah, he cannot be held responsible if he doesn't fulfill the real McCoy chiyuv of Talmud Torah, because he doesn't have time for that. But nevertheless, says the Rambam, chayav likvol ozman, we're going to break new ground over here with a whole new chiyuv, a whole new obligation. And we're going to derive it from V'gisa bo yom v'layla, a separate pasuk. The old psukim of Vishinantam, V'limadatam, Ushmatam lasosam, all those psukim are not going to speak to us. They're not going to hold water here because there's no time for Talmud Torah. But the Ram wants to say, even if you're exempt from Torah study in the pure, objective definition of Torah study, nevertheless you're chayav in a different mitzvah, which is also part of the mitzvah Talmud Torah, and that is V'gisa bo yom v'layla. Find a period. You're going to have to, how should I say, cut out a piece of time. I don't know if it's an hour. I don't know if it's a half hour. I don't know if it's 5 minutes. I don't know if it's 2 minutes. But find the time. When your kids, again, this is a whole issue in child raising. I don't know if you have it in Canada, but here there's a whole issue whether a mother or father could allow their children to watch videos. You know what I'm saying? Because if a child watches a video, then hopefully cartoons or whatever they're watching, then the parents are free. It's like you can breathe. But again, I don't want to get into that issue because the Starkers here are saying no. You can't let your children watch videos. That's absolutely a no. I don't know. In any event, so what happens is that the Rambam says you got to eke out, you got to find a way of cutting out a little bit of time. It's got to be during the day, it's got to be during the night, twice within every 24-hour unit of time, and you have to be kovea, zman, lilmod, bayom, ubalayla. And that's derived from v'gisa bayom v'layla. It's a whole new chiyuv. So if this dissection of the Rambam is correct, and again, I have to admit, I didn't find anyone who really, is so connected to the words of the Rambam that would come up with this pshat. And that makes me a little nervous because, it's a little bit of a chutzpah on my part, 8.5 centuries after the Rambam to come up and say, well, this is what the Rambam had in mind. But that's what I believe the Rambam is saying here. He's got two categories here. The first category, the Rambam is machadesh, a chidush, that don't tell me daito pnuya, ain't daito pnuya. No, you have to overcome all these challenges and all this daiga, and you have to concentrate on your Torah study. And therefore, if you could get to the stage of daito pnuya by overcoming all these, pushing away all these daigas, then you're chayav in the full-fledged mitzvah of Talmud Torah. Then the Rambam's Machadish a second chiddush in the Sefer that although with regard to Daiga, we could obligate you in Talmud Torah, but we have another a technical issue over here, and that is how are you going to implement that mitzvah Talmud Torah if you're so preoccupied with machazal psachim? All of a sudden, you're going to stop being machazal psachim, then you'll drop dead from starvation, or you can't let your kids go without supervision. How are you going to find the time for Torah study? And the Rambam is now machadish a new breakthrough chiyuv, which is a whole new branch in the general constellation of Talmud Torah, which is called likvol ozman min hayom u'min halayla, and he derives it from a different pasuk, from v'gisa bo yomo vola. It's very interesting the Rambam's interpretation of that pasuk. I mean, if you would ask me, I would have said v'gisa bo yom vola means 24/7, but the Rambam say no, v'gisa bo min hayom u'min halayla. That's how the Rambam is reading it. And the Rambam says, dedicate yourself to some minimum Torah study during the day and likewise at night. But we still come back to the original question, which, by the way, becomes even more severe and bothersome when you get to halacha test, where the Rambam says, Gedolei Chacham Yisrael, Hoyu mehem chotvei eitzim, mehem shovei mayim, mehem sumim. I mean, the commentaries go through which Chachamim and Gedolei Chacham Yisrael the Rambam has in mind. Chotvei eitzim apparently refers to either to Hillel Hazaken or perhaps to Rabbi Akiva, and Shovei Mayim I think is that. Let me just see. I think Rav Huna. I don't remember right now. And then we get to Rav Yosef and Rav Sheshes, both were Saginor, they were Suma. And V'afal Piche, despite their difficulties and their challenges, who could imagine the challenge of a Hillel? Or for that matter of Rav Sheshes, Rav Yosef, blind people. Nevertheless, Hayu Oskim v'Talmud Torah Bayomu Balayla. Now here I want to be medayik. The Rambam used the word oskim. We're no longer talking about kovea itim and kovea zmanim in a yom halayla. This is not this, backhanded. Okay, read a paragraph in the Chofetz Chaim's book on Lashon. No. This is the serious stuff. Now I'm talking about the real Makoi Talmud Torah. Shehu oskim b'Torah, and just to confuse us and make the question even more bothersome, how we could derive conclusions on halacha l'doros. So Rambam was writing a halacha sefer for hora l'doros, based on the Gedolei Chachmei Yisrael. The Rambam says hareheim b'chalal matiki ashmua. The Rambam in his introduction to the Mishnah Torah, he has the whole list of matiki ashmua. Those who passed on the Torah from one generation to the other, and he has them all by name. So these names of the Chotvei Eitzim and the Shovei Mayim and the Sumim, they are all listed in the Shalshelas HaKabbalah, the Mesiras HaTorah. They are the Matikei Shmua. And once again, that only makes my problem even more difficult. How can you derive Halach L'Doros from Matikei Shmua Gedolei Chachmei Yisrael? So I would like to, again, if Rabbi, if you want to ask any questions or slug me up or disagree with me, now's a good time. Otherwise, I keep going. I don't see my friend Bruce here today. Okay. I did see Udi before, I think. And now I see the Kotel and Clanton Park Synagogue. I don't know who that is, but anyway. Hi, Udi. I want to say two things. We opened up today with the following question. How much Torah does a person have to learn on a daily basis? How do you define the chiyuv of Talmud Torah? And we mentioned it in the past, there's something called a shir lamata and a shir lamal. In every mitzvah, you have to talk about the minimum and the maximum. Like, for example, if you take Peah, so the minimum of Peah, which is a mission at the beginning of Shas in Peah, Masechta Peah, is just one shibolos. Just give, set aside in the corner of your field one single shibolos, and you fulfill the mitzvah, because that's the shir lamata. Then there's a shir lamala. You can't designate your whole field from beginning to end, from soup to nuts, as Peah. So in every mitzvah, we talk about a shir lamata and a shir lamala, the minimum and the maximum, and so forth and so on. That's called the shir. What is the shir of Talmud Torah? Do you have the same shir that I have?
Elu dvarim shein lahem shir.
Yeah. Can I
Ein lem shir.
Talmud
You know what I
Torah
think ein lem shir? Ein lem shir means pashtus. Again, everybody would, until today, would understand ein lem shir means there's no minimum amount of Talmud Torah. As the Gaon says, every teva, every word of Torah study is a mitzvah unto itself. There's no minimum. It's a koldu. But I would like to add another, how should I say, perspective on ein lem shir. There cannot be a shir for Talmud Torah, by definition. Who says? Just Berzon says. So, you don't have to get nervous, because you don't have to accept what Berzon says. It's not like, I have an overview or anything like that. Why is it that Talmud Torah cannot possibly have a shir by its very essence? And the answer, I believe, is that you can't objectify it. There are no two people that can share the same shir. It's purely subjective. Ein lem shir means you cannot establish a shir. Every dimension of halach has a shir, whether it's revius and yayin, whether it's kizayis in macholos asuros, in matzah, and so forth and so on. And that shir is objective. That's the nature of a shir. A shir, by definition, I'm not talking about our shir once a week. A shir, by definition, is objective. It's shavel l'chol nefesh. That's what a shir is. There ain't no such thing with regard to Talmud Torah. You can't have shavel l'chol nefesh. What the Rambam is looking for, especially in halacha tes of Gedolei Chachmei Yisrael, he's looking for a potential. And he's trying to tell you that you have a potential. Reuven has his potential, Shimon has his potential, Levi has his potential, etc., etc. Every individual will define his shir in Talmud Torah in his own subjective terms. But there's no point in which any of the above four categories at the beginning of halacha ches are absolutely exempt from Talmud Torah. We're all in the same boat. We're all obligated in Talmud Torah, whether you're an ani, an ashir, whether you're a bal yisurim, whether you're a zaken gadol, shetashash koko, you're all in the boat. You're all in the picture. You're all included in the mitzvah Talmud Torah. Now, ask me what the shir is. That's a whole different story. And I'm going to prove to you from the Chachmei Yisrael that their shir was that much greater, and their maximum potential, which they achieved, and gave them the status of Matikei Hashmua, that was their ability to study Torah, despite all the difficulties, And that defines the shear of Talmud Torah for them. Does that mean that I have the same shear of Talmud Torah as Hillel and Rabbi Akiva and Rav Sheshes and Rav Yosef? No, no, no. But the Ram wants to point out to you that you have the capacity and the capability of achieving Talmud Torah. And therefore you're included in the Chiyuv. What exactly is going to be your shear? Well, I'm going to prove from the Gdolei Chachmei Yisrael that you can do it. You, Reuven, you, Shimon, you, Levi, on your own level, on your own turf, according to your own potential. It's purely subjective. Ein lem shear. There's no objective shear like there is in other mitzvahs. But Rabosai, I want to suggest something different and what we call another mahalach in understanding the Rambam. And what I'm about to say, once again, please don't spread the word because it's an election year this year, and I'm running for the Knesset. So if you spread the word about what I'm going to say, nobody's going to vote for me. Just kidding. Although I do have a friend, by the way, who wants to run for the Knesset. Anyway, so here's what I want to say. Gedolei Chachmei Yisrael, Hayu mehem chotvei eitzim, mehem shovei mayim, etc. I want to suggest the following. The Rambam in Perek Gimel of Hilchos Talmud Torah, quoting a Mishnah in Avos, says the following: Ehov es hamalacha, love malacha. Why should I have to love malacha? I mean, after all, if I have to do malacha, okay, I have to do malacha. I got to eke out a living. But do I love it? Wouldn't I rather have, inherited a bundle? Not from TD Bank, but inherited a bundle. Then who would have to go to work? As Dovi Gillis said, work? Well, what's that Hovis HaMalacha? So I looked in the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos on the Mishnah, I think it's Perek Daled, in Avos of Oives HaMalacha. And I was amazed. The Rambam says, Oives HaMalacha mishum emuna. Oh. It's the Mishnah. If you take a look, I don't have time now to look for it, of Antignos Ish Socha. And the Rambam writes, there are three dictums that he, advocated. And the Rambam writes that the common denominator of all three, one of which is Ehovas HaMalacha, is Emuna. What's Emuna? But the Gemara says, if you recall, that Emuna is Seder Zroim. Right? A farmer goes out to his field and he plows and he plants and he waters the field and he harvests the harvest. And the Gemara says that's Royim. The whole involvement in agriculture is Emuna. Why? Because he realizes that everything depends upon God. So I don't want to get too philosophical here. This is not a Mussar Shmooze. But obviously, if it rains too much or too little, you're a goner. You lose your whole crop. If you get attacked by locusts, that's it. So you're really watching the hand of God in front of your eyes. So it's not the pshat that I do malacha and then I pat I pat myself on the back and I say, you know what? Look how much money I made because I did malacha. It's just the opposite. I do malacha and I realize that I'm totally reliant upon God. My dependence upon the Almighty is absolute. And that's part of Ehoves HaMalacha, according to the Rambam Pirush HaMishnayos. Again, here in Hilchos Talmud Torah, he just uses the word Ehoves HaMalacha. He doesn't give you a clue as to why you should love it. But again, we're no longer defining malacha as a means to an end, meaning I should get involved in malacha because otherwise I'm going to starve to death. No. That's not what we're saying. that would the ends and the means that would not justify the word ahava. Why should I love and seek out malacha? It's because of emunah. And if I apply that line of reasoning from the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos over here to Mishnah Torah, which I'm not sure that that's valid, scholarship, because I don't know if, I could draw conclusions, but the word ava does seem to indicate that it's more than just a means to an end. It's more than just a technicality, but rather elves hamalacha. And the Rambam in Pirush HaMishnayos goes on to say, and we'll see it also in Perek Gimel here, Hilchos Talmud Torah, that don't go out and collect tzedakah, work for a living. I mean, the Kesef Mishnah tries to justify how we raise funds for yeshivas and for kollel and so forth and so on. And it's but on a pure ideal theoretical level, the Rambam is absolutely opposed to supporting Torah scholars. Every Torah scholar should be ahov es hamalacha. So that's the ratio of halacha tes, because the Rambam wants to tell you that there's an obligation to go out and work and support yourself and your family, and that's ava, that's emunah, that's something that's not just a fallback position, but that's l'chatchila, that's what you want to do, and that's what you love to do, and you have to love it. Oh, now I ask you the following question. If I'm involved in malacha, and the Rambam advocates that that's what I have to do, and ahoves hamalacha, and that's my emunah, where does Talmud Torah fit in? And I'd like to suggest that there's a tug of war here. There's a real clash pulling us in two directions. Should I dedicate my time to malacha, or should I dedicate my time to Torah? Torah also is going to lead me to emunah. Torah will lead me to Yedias Hashem, to know God through His glorious, deep, profound, endless Torah. But on the other hand, malacha is obligatory, and that will lead me to emunah. So the Rambam writes the following. V'afal pichen. Look at the Rambam in Halacha Tes, if you have a Rambam. Afal pichen, meaning even though they were involved in Chativas Eitzim and in Shavei Mayim and in Elves HaMalacha, and they were fulfilling their obligation to go out and work, even so, they were still learning Torah. What's the even? Usually when the Rambam says afal pi, he's asking a kasha and he's giving a teretz. Well, what was a kasha that bothered the Rambam's mind? That he says afal pi, even so, despite that. The Rambam was bothered. Why do you curtail your avas hamalacha, which is the key to emunah, for the sake of Talmud Torah? Maybe we should say that Avas HaMalacha should take precedence over Avas HaTorah. So the Rambam answers, no, Afal Pichet or your Oski b'Talmud Torah b'Yom V'Layla. We're going to derive a halachic conclusion from the Gedolei Chachmei Yisrael, that even though they were involved in the mitzvah of Oeves HaMalacha, nevertheless, they found the time to be Osik b'Torah b'Yom V'Layla. And therefore, the Rambam is saying that don't tell me, let's say, we'll take the case of an Ani, and then we could say the same thing about an Osh. Don't tell me, Mr. Ani, that you're involved in eking out a living, and you're doing your malacha because you're poor and destitute and you need to do malacha, and that's going to take over your life 24/7, and you don't have time for it. The Rambam is saying no. Because even though you're involved in Oeves HaMalacha, nevertheless, you're still obligated in the mitzvah Talmud Torah. And you're going to have to find the balance, the juggling act. You're going to have to find the shear of Talmud Torah that's appropriate for you, given the fact that you're Oeves HaMalacha. We're going to allow you to put aside the Malacha for the sake of Talmud Torah. So that you have these two methods of coming to Emunah. You've got the method of Avas HaMalacha, that's Emunah, and now you have another method of Emunah through the study of Torah. And Gam Mizeh Mizeh Al Tanach Yedecha, you can't drop either one. And even if you're dedicated to Malacha and Emunah through Malacha, nevertheless, you're still Chayv in Talmud Torah. And that the Rambam is going to derive from the Gedolei Chachmei Yisrael. That's a Horah L'Doros. And that's something that we could derive for each and every one of us. That even though we are obligated in Malacha, nevertheless, we have to take a break and find the izun, as we call it in modern Hebrew, the balance, and try to dedicate as much time to Talmud Torah as we can. And just to summarize, that is my take on the Rambam, but it does not apply to the afilu categories. Because in the case of the afilu categories of ani hamahapech umachazer al psachim or bal ishu banim, that's a whole different issue. That's an issue of someone who doesn't have time for Talmud Torah. Not pshat that he's eking out, a balance, and he's saying, okay, I'll do 5 hours a day of work and another 5 hours a day of Torah. So no. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about a guy who's preoccupied. If he stops knocking on doors, he's going to fall apart. If he stops watching his children, then they don't have supervision. He can't do that. So the Rambam says, nevertheless, there's another mitzvah, another chiyuv, another branch of Talmud Torah, which is called Likval Ozman LeTalmud Torah Bayom V'Alayla Shenemar V'Yigisa Bayom V'Alayla. Okay, Rabbosai, any questions, comments, or criticisms? You probably have no idea how much I'm sweating here, schwitzed, because I worked very, very hard on these Rambams.
Go ahead. Sorry for the noise in the background.
Yeah, Joe, let me ask you.
In other words, but the question is it
when you hear the shit,
is a separate mitzvah, or is it part of the continuum of Talmud Torah? And is it, you could really look at it as a minimum standard of what you must do, even if you don't have time?
Bobby, I'll tell you the truth. If I was writing the Sefer Mitzvahs Rambam, I would put V'Yigisa Bo Yom V'Layla as a separate mitzvah in Taryag. The Rambam doesn't do that. And we're going to see over and over again that there are many, many branches of Talmud Torah, and yet the Rambam, that's his shita in Sefer Mitzvahs in general. Like, for example, in Avodas Karbanos, he has one mitzvah that encompasses a million different dimensions. That's the Rambam shita in the Sefer HaShrashim, in Sefer Mitzvahs. But conceptually, I would tell you that what the Rambam is establishing here at the end of Halacha Ches is a separate mitzvah in Taryag. Maybe it wouldn't be counted for a technical reason because it's derived from Poskin Yoshua. It's not in the 5 books of Moses. But be that as may, conceptually, it's a separate mitzvah of Talmud Torah. The Rambam is going to have a constellation, which he calls the mitzvah Talmud Torah, that has many different branches. And this is one of those branches. But it's not to be equated with the beginning of Halacha Ches, where the Rambam writes, Kol ish Yisrael chayav v'Talmud Torah. He can't be chayav in Talmud Torah, because hafilu mechazer al psachim, and he's a bal ishu banim, his time is not his. He has no control of his time. He's preoccupied, and he can't drop it. But nevertheless, the Rambam says, find a couple of minutes during the day and during the night. We'll soon see, not today because we have to go, but the Gemara has in 2 places in Shas the possibility that he's yotze with Kriyat Shema. Because Kriyat Shema is reading Psukim in the Torah, and that itself is considered V'Yigisa Bo Yom V'Alayla. Very difficult. I'm going to try to, to put that into perspective, because with all due respect to reading Kriyat Shema, that's not really studying Torah. But that's for a different discussion. Okay, Rabbosai, so that's where I want to wish everyone a Chodesh Tov. Here already we davened Mincha, so we didn't have Tachnun. We're already in the Rosh Chodesh El mode. I should send you a video of my son. My son, Menachem, is a tour guide. So I have a video from him last year at this time. He's under a waterfall and he's jumping in. He does wild things on these tours. Anyway, so as he's jumping in, he yells out, Elul! We had the fear of the Lord, Elul, you know. Okay, Rabosai, have a great day and a great week
All too.
Thank
and
you. Thank you.
a wonderful
Clarify.
month of El. Thank you.